our special meeting today with our faculty forum guest, Jessica Taylor. We're very excited to have you. See a few familiar faces and a few, maybe a new face. We have one more person coming in here. So in case you don't know me, my name is Molly Todd, and I'm the president of the CCC, and I'm very excited to be here with you today. And in case you don't know about the CCC, we're a group of graduate students, faculty members, and community members who are interested in learning more about the forces shaping community development, different approaches to community engagement, and thinking about how to build sustainable cross-sectoral partnerships. And we work under the guidance of our faculty advisor, Dr. Max Stevenson. And our research interests range from international case studies. We look to connect theory and praxis. And if you're interested to know more, please reach out to us in the chat. Now, more about our guest, Jessica Taylor. Jessica Taylor is an assistant professor in the history department at Virginia Tech. She teaches U.S. history, oral history, and public history courses for graduate and undergraduate students. Her field experience includes 12 years as a seasonal with the National Park Service, 2 years as a coordinator, 2 years as a coordinator with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, and partnerships with regional organizations. She received her PhD in 2017 and certificate in historic preservation from the University of Florida and has been at Virginia Tech since 2018. Her forthcoming manuscript, Plain Paths and Dividing Lines, Navigating Land and Water in the 17th-Century Chesapeake, will be available in 2022 from UVA Press. Has that come out yet, Jessica?
No, that should say 2023, but maybe I just wanted to rush it along in my head.
2022 and a half-ish from UVA Press. So without further ado, I will pass it along to Jessica Taylor. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I learned by trying and failing a lot of times that playing oral histories on Zoom doesn't work. So I'm gonna link some cool ones like that I've curated that are all Virginia based, which is where I do the majority of my work in the chat. And there's a Halloween one if that's something you're interested in. It's I got my candy apples in Cape Charles. So look for that one there. This is our little playlist. It's about segregation in Halloween, which is something you don't think about on your trick-or-treat route, right? So I'm gonna go ahead and, how many times have you heard this? I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. And let's see, there we go. So what I thought I would do is just go over kind of the process for oral history and a couple of case studies, a couple of things that I've done over the course of the last decade or so. And maybe if you have questions or want to apply this to your research, I would love to talk that through. And I think that that's what groups like this are really great for, because we all have different experiences and different disciplinary backgrounds. So I want to start by explaining what it is, because a lot of people affiliate oral history with journalism or oral history with autobiography and that kind of thing. But really, it's first and foremost a methodology before it has any kind of theoretical grounding. It just means it's a recording of personal testimony. Could be your experience, or it could be something that is passed down, or that is secondhand, or that never happened at all and is in the realm of folklore. So this includes the recording itself. Most researchers, if you've worked with oral histories, use the written form, the transcript, because it's searchable. It's a lot easier to listen to than an actual cassette tape or a VHS. And it's also the other stuff around the interview itself, the work that goes into figuring out what questions to ask, figuring out a person's historical context, and then following up on what was said afterwards as you write it up. So it's oftentimes judged as subjective, more so subjective than written sources. And I would argue that that's certainly not the case. Obviously, people lie to my face all the time, but that doesn't mean they can't lie on paper and have biases and everything like that in paper. And the idea here is that one of the main thrusts and why students get interested in interviewing is because they recognize that oftentimes history is written by people in power. They're very used to the idea that history is written by the victors. And this feels like a way to literally transcribe, bring into the archive other stories that are not from people who have the time or the reason to write down their stories and write history in the way that serves them. So what makes oral history special is that it's a unique combination of orality, the way that we talk, the way that we literally like construct language differently through talking than we do through text. We oftentimes call it elliptical. We more circular than when if you were to write your autobiography, what you would sound like. It's also about narrative, so how we construct meaning from the events that we're talking about, and how the orality fuels that. And then it's performative. Everybody, the interviewer and the narrator both are performing. Everybody has a particular way that they speak to others and that they adjust according to their own positionality and race, class, and gender, and the positionality of others. In oral history, we call that intersubjectivity. And mutability. And this is something that bothers all of my science friends. They are very annoyed that you will never replicate the results. And I've done this, where we have an interview that's done with someone 1 year, and then the same questions are asked of that person 5 years later, different answers. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in the age of COVID as well. So, I mean, most obviously the interview will change with the interviewer if you change the interviewer out. But people's understandings of the things that have happened to them, of their position in history, are always changing based on how media and culture is changing. So oral history really got started with, first of all, the ability to record, and that, that's the late 19th century, early 20th century. Some of the earliest interviews were with people who were in the Plains Wars, who were Native. The idea being that, like, a lot of the Native cultures in the Plains people thought were dying out, and so they were going to go, record their stories in their languages and put it in an archive somewhere. But oral history, as people being able to tell their own stories rather than just say words on command, is we really situate that with the Works Progress Administration, slavery narratives. That's when really, actually now very famous folklorists like Zora Neale Hurston and Stetson Kennedy went around the South and interviewed people in the 1930s and 1940s who were born into slavery. And those are at the Library of Congress today and are considered kind of like the birth of oral history. And since the 1960s, oral history has really taken off because of an emphasis on social history. History from below is what historians often call it. And that includes like histories of segregation. So starting to question the ideas that, segregation and slavery, like, at least were economically beneficial to the South and things like that. And the role of oral history inside of history itself has changed a great deal as well. And how a lot of people really use it, including again, my science friends, is they see it as a way to add local color to something. They see it as a way to add narrative to something that, something more like theoretical and like more quantitative than qualitative. than I would normally do. So they might have, their paper about a thing and they want a case study. And so then they'll use an oral history interview for it. The idea for historians is oftentimes that, they'll write a traditional history and then they'll plug in some interviews without actually questioning the ways that oral history can help actually change their analysis. And that's starting to change a lot more. So the new model is that oral history is not necessarily opposed to archival sources, but it can add complexity. And sometimes archival sources are wrong and oral histories are right. And that's the case with particularly government documents that were made to, well, I have an example up here. Let me just show you the example. So this is not Stetson Kennedy. This is Stokely Carmichael, who was a civil rights worker in the 1960s, who was arrested multiple times and later became a Black separatist in the 60s and 70s. And the Mississippi state police were very integral in like the resistance to the civil rights movement, putting down essentially like Black resistance. So the records from the State Bureau of Investigation, I think is what they call it in Mississippi, were only released in the last decade. And a lot of them don't actually make sense. So you can see that he was arrested here for handing out brochures without a permit. And we asked, people when we went to the Delta and talked to civil rights workers, what was actually going on. And it actually changes our ideas about nonviolent resistance in the South on the part of Black people. One of the things that came out was that Stokely Carmichael was training local people in the Mississippi Delta to create Molotov cocktails in order to throw into the houses of Klansmen, who were oftentimes also cops. And that was a whole narrative that was left out of government documents for a lot of reasons. And that only came out because of oral history, but that also shows us that oral history can actually change what we think about the civil rights movement itself. And when I ask our students, what they think, they always say Martin Luther King and nonviolence. And Margaret Block here, and I can send the clip if anyone's interested, but Margaret Block here says, "No one told me I was nonviolent." And she talks about how she used to carry a knife in her skirt so that she could stick the sheriff in the eye. And all of that just never made it into written sources. So what I like to say, just to keep it simple, is that oral history records social fact, even if it ends up being factually untrue. And it opens up research into the study of collective memory, which in oral history is, in the field of oral history, is a very large part of what we do. I'll skip that. To move on to the process, this is how it works at Virginia Tech and at other institutions across the country. And I like to show this so that people understand it's not just the interview. There's a lot of research and preparation that goes into what we do before we conduct an interview, but the majority of the work happens after the interview itself in order to make it accessible. And responsible archiving means making it accessible to appropriate people. We edit the transcripts, we send them back to people along with the audio so that they understand what they actually said, and how they were perceived before it goes in, and they can take things out if they need to, so that we're essentially like sharing authority over this document. And then we make it accessible to folks at the, publicly or not, depending on what the initial agreement was. And I can share Virginia Tech's like documents about this as well. So for my initial case study here, this is a more traditional oral history project that I started about a decade ago now, or maybe a little bit more than that. It is a pretty large scale oral history project with 200 interviews from the Chesapeake Bay. So Virginia, the Middle Peninsula, Northern Neck, and the Eastern Shore, which you can see here. And it was based around the student schedule for undergraduates, first at William and Mary and then at University of Florida, where we would go on a major fieldwork trip once a year. I'm actually hoping to get that started again in April, in case anyone's interested. And the theme would change every year in partnership with nonprofit organizations. Primarily, though, we were really interested in what people who worked on the water, which is a declining industry because of seafood population collapse and unpredictability, what they were interested in as far as like environmental change and climate change goes, how they were adjusting to the ideas of climate change and environmental change, and how they were thinking about it politically. So we interviewed all kinds of people, including planners, who were, responsible for like the major highway systems that made it so that seafood is transported differently. We interviewed like local fishermen, and we interviewed also people who were involved in the local food movement, like restaurateurs and people like that. But we also looked at the census and more traditional archival sources like newspapers, so that we could actually see how people adjusted economically to a lot of these things that were happening. So one thing that happened during the early 20th century was the Great Migration, and that radically changed the entirety of Eastern Virginia economically. So you can see here families of Black fishermen who are on the in the census rolls in the 1940s, but not in the 1950s. And then we can find that they moved to Baltimore or wherever. So we are working with archival sources, even as we're gathering people's narratives, because oftentimes a white fisherman will say, yeah, it's all white here. And we don't see any kind of Black presence at all in their particular narratives. And then when we go to Virginia, there are fewer Black people to talk to there because a lot of their family members have left. So a lot of what we do also is create archives as well, by taking people's sources that they have in their houses, oftentimes ships logs, photographs, local newspapers that don't even make it into archives because they're so local. They serve like a few hundred people in a very small town. And that also helps us to like add a little bit of texture and understanding to, for example, like you can see like Black laborers working on an oyster boat that may not come up in a white person's interview, may not come up in those newspapers, and certainly won't come up in like larger national sources. And it helps us understand why people are so resistant to the idea of climate change politically, very, very worried about the industry rather than about climate change. The water industry in particular is very generational. Most people get into it because their family members do it. It's usually an uncle or a father. It's very gendered. And so we're seeing this like pretty huge breakdown, pretty catastrophic breakdown in the family cycle, like the generational cycle, where people are very worried about who's going to like keep this knowledge alive and these networks alive. So this is actually a picture of one of the watermen, Kevin, who is the youngest waterman in his county at age 45. So it's also some of the like oldest demographics in the state as well. What I really kind of, what I believe happens here is that, environmental change is experienced locally, and what people are doing is interpreting it through past busts, and people are very familiar with seafood collapses, whether it's like viruses or red tide, major busts related to international competition from Southeast Asia. So there's a lot of sense of we've already survived something like this. So how is this any different? Understanding that the change is happening, not denying the change is happening, because these are people in the front lines and they can see it, they can see the red tide and they understand that there's a problem, but not really necessarily on the same page in terms of the language that they're using as other people in the state or in the country. Whoop. So a couple cool things came from this. One of them is a community published book. So one of our partner nonprofits, like a local historical society, was able to use some of our interviews in their like big, like this is the story of us publication that they took them years to put together, that they loved. But one of my favorites is actually a preservation effort. So we did a little like sub piece of a like a sub oral history project just about this estate here called Timberneck, built around 1798, and a major place where, as you can see, people were fishing in the York River. And it was a really interesting time to do like kind of a close study. And I'll let this just kind of play, see if something to look at. And it's also kind of a spooky haunted house too. So this was a project where we first, this is not an interview, this is just us trying to get the lay of the land, went around the house, kind of tried to figure out how the house was used with this caretaker here. It had been not lived in for many decades, as you can see. And also like all the different kinds of people that use the house over the course of 200 years. And my favorite story is actually about this door. So there was this oral tradition that we recorded that the door was thick enough, which it is, it's very thick, to stop native attacks on the house. And that didn't make sense because the house was built in 1798, over 100 years after there was any conflict with Native people in the area. What we found was through another story about a fire at a different house, was that this house was probably, this door was probably taken from a much older house and then retrofitted to fit this door. So that it actually probably, the story could have been true, just only about a different house. By doing all these interviews about how the house was used over the course of the 20th century, we were actually able to help put together a successful National Register nomination and grant applications to make the house looks better than it looks right here. So that's actually a work in progress now, and it was really cool to be a part of it. So that was, and that's also very unusual for oral histories to be considered evidence in a National Register or a state landmark nomination. This is a project that's been going on for decades, and it's evolved as politics nationally has evolved. So we're interested in learning like what kind of research questions and applications are interesting to our community that we're working with as the project evolves. But have we reached like authentic co-authorship or like authentic collaboration with all parties? I don't feel like we have, and part of that is because of those big demographic shifts. We're missing a huge piece of the story, both from Indigenous and Black watermen. So second here is a project that's currently ongoing with people who are descended from the Fraction family, who were people who were enslaved at Solitude Plantation, which is now Virginia Tech's campus. So this is a project that is really spearheaded by the person I'm interviewing here, Kira Mosley Hobbs, who is one of the main descendants that brings people together for events and finds new descendants, people who are interested in pursuing and kind of rediscovering and researching their past. We've done interviews mostly at like family reunions and events at Solitude, and it's not by any stretch of the imagination just me. Like there are other historians in the library and the history department who have done this work, and it's also a lot of students who have shown up and helped transcribe and archive these. The great thing about these, though, is that they are archived with Virginia Tech, so Virginia Tech is the custodians of that, but the descendant community has basically a Google Drive where they can look through everything and listen to each other's interviews. And then that generates really cool new questions related to, you know, this person said this thing and this person said this other thing about our descendant. Can we kind of figure out, can you ask this other group of people if they know anything? And so it's sort of like a crowdsourcing information, but we're archiving every step of that. And I do think that this approaches co-authorship, like authentic collaboration, a lot more, because we are working with Kira like on the actual like knowledge production of this. So like doing conference papers together, kind of figuring out exhibits together, and you saw us, in front of a green screen. This was for a Virginia Tech exhibit. And then also bringing other people into the conversation so that it's not just Kira, which is, I think, a problem that a lot of programs like ours have, where there's a reliance on just one person. It's also part of the university's Studying Slavery initiative, which is national and helps us kind of think through how other campuses are doing this kind of work. So there's a community of people nationally and internationally that are interested in this. But we also want to make it accessible in a way that is ethical. So we as a campus function in a situation where we work with people who have been displaced by slavery. So a lot of people had to leave the South in order to escape violence, in the case of the fractions, or for opportunity in a lot of other cases. But we also work in a context of displacement, where Virginia Tech has displaced Black people after slavery, into the 20th century. And then this also has to do with the native roots of this being, Monacan, traditional Monacan territory. So how do all of these audiences interact? And how can we, first of all, tell a story that is true without re-traumatizing people or profiting in some indirect way from people explaining their trauma on camera, which is sometimes, I think, a pretty justifiable critique of oral history, particularly oral history of trauma and crisis. One way that I think that we've done that is through the project design. People sign up for it, first of all, so they know exactly what we're going to ask ahead of time, and it's through crowdsourcing the questions that's really helpful. But we also want to show that to the audience, that there is a spectrum of ways that the people within a descendant community feel about being in a descendant community, about the origins of that descendant community, like about the plantation itself. This is a really great example. One of the questions that I was asked to ask was about, is Virginia Tech home for you? And this was a question that was offered by historians rather than by descendants. And some people kind of struggled with the question, and some people were very decisive about the fact that it's not. And that kind of, I think, is informative for people to see. So when we put it together in the exhibit, we made sure that you weren't just presented with one descendant. You were presented with a lot of descendants with short clips, and all these interviews are not a typical oral history interview. They're like 10 to 15 minutes to an hour instead of 1 to 2 hours. And the students get to basically work through all of these oral histories and kind of compare people's perspectives. So there's the augmented reality exhibit. We're hoping to do a physical exhibit, hopefully next spring. And the interpretation that's happening inside of Solitude is continuing to develop as well. But there are problems with this, including how you, like we talked about, how you share this content with diverse audiences, how you pick clips out of hundreds of hours of oral history interviews, but also how you avoid capitalizing on trauma. And this is something that Kira is especially interested in and has presented on with us, how creating basically a 3D narrator, like in this case, can feel like a burden. And how do we not make co-authorship in general a burden to people, and compensating people for their time is something that oral historians have sort of flip-flopped on to a degree as well. The last one I want to just show you really briefly is the Southern Foodways Alliance Mutual Aid During COVID-19 in Southwest Virginia project. This is really representative of both the digital turn, we've been talking about the digital turn since 1995, I guess, but the digital turn in terms of Zoom and COVID, the way that we have all of a sudden decided that like interviews don't have to happen in your house or in a place that's special to you. They can happen over Zoom and they can happen anytime. And so there were a lot of COVID related oral history projects that came out nationally, and Tech has been involved in a couple of them. So this was a small one that I sort of took on as a way to introduce my graduate students when I could not, because we weren't doing interviews in retirement homes anymore, as you can imagine. So what we did was we interviewed people in Roanoke and the New River Valley who were doing nonprofit work, who were doing activist work, but also who were involved in food work or restaurant work generally, and came up with a lot of really interesting stuff. But I also, you know, I do have some questions about it as a methodology, as something that increasingly with Zoom, these oral histories that are national, these oral history collections that are national and are crowdsourced, I think can be very methodologically loose, which is something that I'd be interested in talking to you all about, because I've been getting a lot of requests from graduate students that want to do these interviews over Zoom, but maybe don't have a good sense of, for example, like how you sample or how you archive interviews like this. So this is a project that's still not like totally complete yet, but there was a really cool thing that they did with this when it comes to that concept of mutability, where we interviewed people at the beginning of the pandemic, and then we interviewed people at the end of the pandemic, and essentially asked the same questions of people and asked how things had changed. And I think that was a really interesting choice on the part of the Southern Foodways Alliance to get their perspectives on just how little things had changed when it felt like things had come to a close with COVID. And how people sort of withdrew from that mutual aid work, even though the needs of the community had not changed. So that was one of the really interesting things that came out of this particular project. And I think that might be it right here. Just to give you some extra resources, and I can link these in the chat. We do have really extensive paperwork for, you know, for example, style guides and deeds of gift on the Center for Oral History website and the Oral History LibGuide site, which you can just Google Virginia Tech Oral History LibGuide. I think is probably the place to go if you want to look at the current archives and look at the current deeds of gift. And then the Oral History Association also has some really amazing just best practice white papers that are a really important place to start. They're not very long, but they can just give you a sense of where the field is at in terms of ethics. And those have come out in just the last couple of years, have been updated. And I would say that our two big players outside of Chapel Hill are University of Kentucky and Columbia for our field. If you want to see how they present their work, for example, just as an archive, and the kinds of projects that they're doing, particularly for Columbia and politics, that's a really great place to go. So thank you so much. And I always, obviously it's my job, look forward to a conversation.
Thank you so much, Jessica Taylor. Let's give her a round of virtual digital applause, whatever that looks like.
Thank you.
And now we are going to open to the group for questions and discussion. Does anyone have a burning question to start? I'd be happy to get us started. Thank you very much for your presentation. I was ferociously writing notes the whole time. It was great. I'm interested more in the methodology, and kind of, I guess, building on your comment about wondering, you know, what does this look like digitally and kind of what are the ethics behind it? And I was curious about kind of the relationship building aspect, you know, in like ethnographic methods or something. Part of doing the interviews and that work is building relationships. And I'm curious, with oral histories, it sounds like even when you mention samples, maybe you're interviewing people you only meet once. So kind of how do you navigate the relationships and basically the trust when you're having those conversations?
It's different every time, and it's different in every community, and I think that's how it should be. I think the first thing is, especially because I do a lot of work around people's occupations, that it's about their seasons and like their patterns and rhythms of life. So I would never head down to Virginia and expect to interview seafood processors in the height of summer, because that's when there's a huge amount of work. And it's about knowing that ahead of time, knowing how to be considerate, and not parachute in. And I also think that we partner with nonprofits a lot, but oftentimes it's not just about nonprofits. And I think that there's folks on the call that I recognize that I know, partner with families first, or they partner with churches first. And there's nothing wrong with that. It oftentimes people, everyone has overlapping social circles, where they volunteer at this one thing, or they go to this one library, but they also go to this one church. And tapping into particular people who have those can be really great. And that's, I think, oftentimes why we partner with nonprofits so often, because it does draw those kinds of people out. But I wouldn't be able to continue to go to Eastern Virginia if I did not have core people in each of those little dots that you saw, that always have like someone else in their head that is also, that they are really invested themselves in like getting their stories. I think for community members especially, there's a sense of urgency. Like there's a sense that like this person is going to die soon, and like you need to be the person to like put it on the record. That was especially true before cell phones, were able to do that. But that continues to be true now. I think that's what's driving a lot of, particularly in Eastern Virginia, particularly with the descendant community folks, because people are finding each other and then finding out that that person is 95 that they just found. And it's true, like the majority of people I've interviewed are dead now. And there's a reason that we prioritize that. So finding people who share not necessarily the same research question, but they have their own research question, and their own motivations. Oftentimes they work for a historical society, but it's better when it's a mix of those people and people that, just have a grandpa, that they miss and things like that. So yeah, I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I see a hand from Lehigh.
Oh,
how's it going? You think I would know how to use this after 2 years, right? Yeah, absolutely fascinating. Thank you for that, taking us through, the process and the methodology. Just a quick question, and I think it's so important because, even with what's happening with Ukraine, right? There's going to be two sides to that story, right? The Russian propaganda side and then the Ukrainian honest side. So I think what you're doing is absolutely phenomenal. And how do you recommend we combat? I mean, for example, even like the 1619, the book, a slave ship and all that to Richmond. How do we combat when people are saying, even though it's the truth, and like people are trying to say, we don't want that in our libraries because it contradicts what the victors say? What is your take on it? It's just, an honest opinion.
yeah. They're really interesting. So I would say the vast majority of oral history projects are doing that work of social history, of documenting things that are not formally documented. But there is a subset of oral historians, and I think it's really interesting, who do those interviews with people who genuinely believe things that are problematic and damaging to the world. The one that comes to mind first is Kathleen Blee does work with women who are in the Klan, even if they make cookies for the Klan, or they're like full on in the Klan, like that kind of thing, and examines like the gender and racial dynamics of that, and tries to pick it apart. I don't think that, and there's a lot of women that do that, and they are major upholders of hate groups in the 21st century. I don't think that we should underestimate the impact that they have. And in terms of like the complexity of their stories, I don't think that we should hold it up as a positive thing, but it is a way to use your privilege to like look at what they are saying, really ask them about it, really ask them to like explain why they feel that way, and then like, yeah, be part of tearing it apart. And even, you know, in Eastern Virginia, this is a huge problem where people say that there are no Black people, and like the civil rights movement was not a thing, you know, and that's just objectively untrue. Um, and trying to understand, like, are you, I mean, they're perpetuating propaganda, but where did they hear this? And how does it serve them economically or otherwise? That's especially true in Eastern Virginia now, because Black labor has been replaced by temporary visa labor. And so there are these really interesting immigration narratives that are developing right now. And it's important to document them as they develop, because it's literally racism as it develops. So there's something really important there that I, as like a super friendly, like white person, can do, unfortunately. So that, I think that's a big piece of it, but also elevating, you know, I think oftentimes with oral history, what happens is people do it, and then it ends up in a closet, and it ends up in a desk drawer, and it ends up in literally spent years working on a big project that ended up in a guy's attic. And giving it back to people. This was a Native nation in the Southeast. Giving it back to people was the first time they'd heard their grandparents talk. And so like making it accessible, and making sure, like, that's what we as a university can do, is if people want their stories to be accessible, which that's why they're handing it to you, like that's a big part of your responsibility, especially when it's serving that purpose. It's not even about like it being public in that case, it's about serving like the needs of strengthening like those community ties and family ties that were important before.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for your question, Lehigh. I see Brad's hand.
Yes, I'll echo the appreciation for your talk today, Jessica. Thank you so much. So a couple questions came to mind, and they're a little different, and you can tackle this however you want to. But you know, we've all been in conversations where you think it's going to go one way, and it winds up that there's another topic that's much more interesting that you wind up stumbling upon. So I wonder how you kind of manage that semi-structured versus structured versus more open interview process. But then secondly, I'm also intrigued that I think a lot of the power from something like an oral history comes from the fact that it is someone's voice that you're hearing in that space, but they're so often articulated through written works such as books and things like that. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about effective communication of that, and if there's any way to kind of ensure that the power of hearing those voices is maintained in the presentation.
Let me go with the last one first, because I was taking notes. So that is a problem. I think it's a stone cold problem that we rely on the textual evidence of the oral evidence, and I don't think it is what the narrator usually intended. And that in itself is a problem, particularly when you, as an archivist or a historian, are like trusted with someone's words. You're stripping it of its sarcasm, its humor, the emotion of any kind. You know, you just put in brackets cries, and and then that ends up in your book. So you're missing a lot, no matter what, when you strip it of its the orality. That's what makes oral history unique, first and foremost. And there is a really interesting, like, few things that I've seen done. Some of them I think more effective than others. I think that there is, particularly with the open access movement, And with the move towards digital publishing, we're going to be seeing a lot more of like, yes, here's the transcript, but like, here's the audio, please listen to the audio. And most people now will put that at the beginning of the transcript, like on the cover page, like, this is not a replacement for the audio. The audio is the most accurate thing, because even if you transcribe it, 10 people are going to transcribe something 10 different ways, particularly if it's not standard English, right? It's like standard English. There's that. And then there's also a pushback against transcribing itself. So what you'll see is a lot of people are saying, I'm not going to transcribe it, I'm going to index it, and then you listen to it yourself and you transcribe it. So the onus is on the researcher to do the job that they're doing. But the other thing about that is that for narrators, like, they're probably not doing it for historians. They're probably doing it for their friends and their kids and their families and their communities, their libraries, things like that. So the more that we share access, again, of the actual audio, whether that's like depositing it somewhere else or, making it available to family members, the better off we are. And can you repeat your first question?
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And the first question was just about how you manage conversations that don't go where you anticipate and maintaining a structure of interviewing questions.
Yeah, the structure is a joke. The structure doesn't work. What most people follow a life history where they try to keep people chronologically going, so that they're not hopping around and they're not getting muddled, and so that the interviewer can follow. So it usually starts with, what are your earliest memories of whatever? And then sometimes the person who answers, it's like interviewing a tornado, and they'll just talk for 50 minutes. It's like having a conversation with a person at a restaurant. And sometimes they are really reticent, but sometimes they tell you something that you didn't like, it doesn't answer the question, and then your question becomes, what question are they trying to answer? And that's always like a really big, like, cognizant moment of like, oh, this is where they want this to go, and they didn't make that clear at the beginning. And that has gendered components as well. So oftentimes, like, and this was true more 10 years ago than now, women of an older generation are very reticent to talk about their lives, because they say, I didn't do anything, because that's the gendered way that we talk about career trajectories, right? If they stayed at home, for example, and that they don't really have anything to offer. But part of when things go poorly is being able to anticipate it. And some of the worst interviews that I've done, I just did not know, like, I wasn't trauma informed in the way that oral historians are now, where when I was interviewing a Vietnam War vet and he was talking about how all his friends died, and like, he didn't, and I said, that's not your fault, right? And the interview ended right there. And I just didn't think about it, because I was a grad student, I didn't know. Arming yourself with an understanding, particularly as oral history becomes more about trauma and crisis and displacement and migration, arming yourself with that literature is really important.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dr. Taylor. Kathy, I see your hand.
Thank you. God, this has been so fascinating. I just love it. I spent 20 years as a reporter, so did lots and lots of interviews, and just, this is grand. One of the things I wanted to ask you about was interviewer bias. How, when you're working with students, when you're preparing people to sit down with people, they may have in their mind, after having done their research and things, the story they expect to come out. And that may not be the story they're going to get. So, or they may be bringing with them we all have our personal biases. So how do you deal with that? How do you prepare your interviewers for, so that they don't consciously or unconsciously steer the interview to what they want?
Mm-hmm. There was a cop that took one of our workshops, because he's also an interrogator, and he was like, this is different from what I do. And I was like, I know, bud, But the thing is, we all come into oral history interviews like with a position. And rather than being like, okay, like I'm going to try to remain as neutral as possible, it's so important to own like the position that you have. And so oftentimes, particularly because our groups of students are from a lot of different identities and they're all in the same van together, having to interrogate that and like how they are interacting with people from different identities based on their own position is something that is really like, we spend a lot of time on that, because they're particularly like younger. I mean, no offense, you know, to the 18-year-olds in the room, but oftentimes it's about saying like, you know, part of being like a human person in a conversation is that it's not all about you. And I call it my oral history arsenal. It's like a list of files of like good and bad interview clips. And there's this one where one of my students is interviewing one of the first women to go to the vet school. And she's talking about how hard it is and, you know, how she felt like really out of place and unwelcome. And the student just goes, I have a dog. and you're like, you know, I saw that, bless your heart. But like, is this about your dog or is it about like gender discrimination, you know? And having students like track the larger themes while also recognizing how they're reacting to those themes based on the interview itself, based on their own position, is important. That's why we do a lot of transcript work ahead of time. So first of all, they transcribe someone else's, they listen for like that intersubjectivity, like kind of noise. And then when they get done with their interview, they spend a lot of time transcribing it and like thinking about how they could have done things differently in the moment. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jessica, I was interested in this. There seems to be a conjunction among many between kind of the work we're trying to do in community, eliciting dialogue, having listening sessions, talking to people about direction and so on, and what you call community memory. We get a lot of both. You know, when we work in community, we hear a lot about this is what it was like in 1965, in Appalachia particularly. We have a potential project on the horizon with a community that lost an historically Black college, and particularly it's an alumni group associated with this community and associated with the college that is already emerging as a question of memory as much as not. And I guess I'm interested in this conjunction of they're interested in what do we do with a campus or what do we do with a library, but it's all bound up in wounded memory, all bound up in prideful memory. There are various kinds, I think, that I could articulate. And so I was fascinated by this collective idea of collective agency and possibilities for change and how they're interrelated to memory as you were presenting it. And I don't know if you've thought about that. We think about it kind of from the agency and social change side. You seem to be considering memory for its own sake. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I did try to kind of point out with like the Timberneck example that it does have practical utilities for people that are.
Yeah, I want to live there. I decided I want to live there.
No, you don't. That place is horrifying. Wow.
No, but what a beautiful place is what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, totally, of course. So one case study that I didn't use for this was Calfee, which is in Pulaski that we worked with last year, where the oral histories were part of a larger discernment process about like what they wanted to do with the historically Black school. And there's a lot of literature on this actually, like how like memory, like the collecting of oral histories is oftentimes done within like this sense of profound loss over like a place where like Black children were nurtured, and it's like a Black space that was very like safe, and like a lot of community members who were leaders in the community worked there as teachers and principals and things like that. So Within that, though, within the oral histories, it became a way, first of all, for more people to get involved and invested. But it started what became a larger conversation about what are the things they want to see in the museum space, and what do they want the other spaces to look like what memories, for example, the cafeteria came out as a huge memory across all of these interviews. And so now they're thinking about the cafeteria as potentially being like a place that is usable by community members. So it does have community change components to it. It is about, how the project is designed from the beginning, rather than kind of going back into the archives, I think, usually. But yes.
Yeah, that's helpful.
I guess I have one question, and if we don't have time for it, that's fine. And I'm not sure that, I hope you didn't address it. I just went way over my head, but I was thinking about, qualitative research methods, interviews, that you might use in a program evaluation setting, which is how we use them a lot. And they're semi-structured. We usually have targeted questions we're trying to get at. And I just wondered, have you seen oral history qualitative transcripts used in that kind of reductive way to the detriment? I mean, I can imagine it's to the detriment of the material, but have you used it in positive ways too, successful ways?
I would say that I have been involved in community surveys that do like the kind of coding, I think that like people that do quantitative work would be familiar with. It's not really something that comes out a lot in oral history, but there is an interesting there's an interesting study going on in a couple of different places where they're using AI to code like huge groups of interviews that have been done, like 250 plus interviews that have been done historically. So they weren't created to do this. They were created as like individual narratives. And they're coming up with some interesting results, like particularly when it comes to linguistics. But in terms of how oral history is usually designed, you have like maybe 10 or 12 questions, but honestly, like you don't get to them. Like you might get to 5 or 6, and then it's 2 hours gone, and everybody takes that question. The questions are usually very broad, and everybody kind of does something different with them. And I have done the interviews that you're talking about where it's like, these are my questions and we're going to get to all of them before the sentence, and then we're going to code them, and so it's a totally different process, completely different process. And I think it does make like my social science friends like kind of uncomfortable, but humanities.
Yeah, that's okay. I just wanted to, feel out the distinction, and there it is, loud and clear. So thank you. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Maybe we don't have time, but have you came across any situation where people deny part of their history for shameful reasons, or for hiding part that they make, that makes them feel that they don't fit in within the current society?
Yeah. Yes. 100%. Some of them are about just how you deal with past lives, So one of the worst interviews I've ever processed was there was a woman who, she made Santa Claus dolls in Eastern Virginia. And she was also, and everybody knew it because she had an accent and because she had a tattoo, a survivor of Auschwitz from Romania. And the interviewer did not want to let that part go. And she was there to talk about Santa Claus dolls, and he was there to talk about Auschwitz. And she was not interested in talking about Auschwitz. I don't think it was because of shame. I think it was just like, she's in this community that she's the only person like herself. And also that's like a lot of profound trauma to like put on a recording, So there's things like that. There's also I think sometimes a degree of shame that comes relative to the person that you're talking to, In cases where someone has struggled with alcoholism or something like that, they might talk about it off the recording, but you can tell it affects the tone, like during the recording. We did a study on history of addiction, and the types of shame that come out of that are very like culturally imbued are really difficult to escape, even if the interviewer is as non-judgmental as possible, you know, because they make a series of assumptions about the interviewer, right? And what the interviewer is thinking.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Thank you for that last really good question. And I just want to respect everyone's time here. We have run out. It is officially the end of the hour, but let's give Jessica Taylor one more round of applause. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure I'm not the only one who still has a million questions. So this was a great conversation and topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for having me.